Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We have Mary Preskin here with LRE Water. She's going to be talking to us about water rights and how we value them, why we might want to have the value of a water right. And she's going to go through what it looks like to kind of arrive at that destination. And we are going to turn it over to her. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. And it's a pleasure to be here today. As Amber said, my name is Mary Pressican, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the science, and some may say the art of valuing a water right. A little bit of background about me, just so you know where I am coming from and my experience. I have just completed 23 years at LRE Water. And I am an engineer by training, undergrad, master's in civil and environmental engineering, with 29 years of experience, 23 of that in the Colorado water resources, water rights space. I've worked in most of the divisions throughout the state. Most recently, the majority of my work is in the South Platte, in the Arkansas, and then a little bit out in the San Juan. So, yes, as Amber said, what we're going to talk about today, just brief agenda. So, a little bit about water rights and what it means to be real property, various reasons that you may want to understand the value of the water, of your water right, some key terminology that we use in the process of valuing water rights. Then we're going to step through the process, what is included in that water rights valuation process. And then finally, we're going to talk about some best practices and just some things to note as you or others may be going through the process. I should say that I cannot see the chat or hands raised right now. So please, if you do have a question, it would be best to just interrupt me or let me know. Okay, so um, first, just as to lay the foundation. A water right is a real property, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is exactly the same as, say, a land property. So, like land, water rights can be bought, they can be sold, encumbered. A water right will have a legal description. At the very least, it should have a type of use, a place of use, an amount of use. But it may also have some additional legal descriptions to it. Water rights are protected by law. They have economic value, and you do require due process to change or take like eminent domain type takings. But unlike land, a water right can be sold separately from the land on which it was historically used. That ownership interest is a right to use the water. It's not actually the water itself. I think most of you listening to this right now, you understand that, our waters, really the state is the owner. If you hold a water right, you just have the right to use that water. So oftentimes you'll hear the phrase usufructuary in that context. So the right can be lost by intentional non-use. So terminology that oftentimes you will hear, the use it or lose it, or water rights that get abandoned. Important to point out there that it is an intentional non-use. And then finally, unlike land, to change a water right, you do need to go through a court process. So that for us is we call that the water court process. So since water is a real property interest, normal appraisal practices for the valuation of real property do apply in the context of valuing water rights. So why might you want to know what the value of your water right, and why do you want to understand that? So there's a variety of reasons, and we're going to get into this in a little bit. But the reason that you value or what your intended end use for that value is going to dictate the process and how it is someone like myself would go about valuing that water right. So some of the different reasons why a value for water may be of interest. You might be doing some estate planning. An individual might want to just have an idea of what is the value of their assets. Individual or a company may need to use that water as collateral for a loan. Project development, you may want to know, for a ditch reservoir company, you might want to know, okay, what's it going to take to actually complete a full project if you have to acquire water and then also build out a project. Optimizing your resources, which water right might you want to focus on and use more of to build value. Conservation programs or conservation easements require valuations of water right. Dedications of water will require understanding the value. Also, some of the more traditional, like you're buying water rights, you're selling water rights, you're leasing, you may be entering or developing a water supply contract. You want to know what's the dollar value we should place on that contract. Assignment of contract entitlements or trades. And there's also a variety of other very creative type programs that folks across the state are entering into, ag transfers, ATM programs. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but just a variety of reasons why it would be important to know what the value of that water is. Okay, so a couple phrases that are important to understand when we are valuing water. So the first is fair market value. So this is actually defined by the US Supreme Court, and it is defined as the amount for which, in all probability, the property would be sold by a knowledgeable owner, willing but not obligated to sell, to a knowledgeable purchaser who desires but is not obligated to buy. So in short, it's the sale price giving a willing buyer and a willing seller. Very important. If there is not a willing buyer or a willing seller, if an individual is required to sell a water right, they may be willing to sell it at a lower price. In that situation, the dollar value, the value of that as a comparable sale would not actually be a fair market value of that particular water right. Next concept is the concept of beneficial use. I believe that most of you listening to this understand beneficial use, but it's also just good as a reminder. So beneficial use is defined by the Colorado Revised Statute, and it is the use of the amount of water that is reasonable and appropriate under reasonably efficient practices to accomplish without waste the purpose for which the appropriation is lawfully made. So in short, I think of beneficial use as the basis, the measure, and the limit of a water right. The last phrase or term that is important to know and to understand when valuing water rights is highest and best use. So this is a term that is defined by, you'll hear the term USPAP, which is the Uniform Standards for Professional Appraisal Practice. So this is kind of our go-to Bible for what the process of an appraisal entails. And so within that kind of uniform standards, there's a four-part test for defining the highest and best use. Number one, is it legally permissible? So the use must be allowed by the applicable and relevant laws, code, deeds, regulations. So think about, in this case, various decrees for that water right. What is it, the water court process? What are the bylaws? Maybe it's shares in a mutual ditch company that we are valuing for the purpose of sale. So what do the bylaws say about what can or cannot be done with those shares? What do the deeds say? Are there elements in the deeds that restrict the use of that water? And there may even be zoning ordinances about where that water cannot be used. Thinking about either where it currently is or where it may be moved to. Physically possible is the second test. So when thinking about physically possible, what we are thinking about is, can the water be physically changed and delivered to a proposed new place of use? I was valuing a water right, which was a feudal water right, down in kind of lower division 2. And the individual wanted to know what the value of that water. And I said, well, the limit for this particular feudal water right is that you cannot physically move it to a different place of use, because the value is tied to the location where it is used right now. Should you move it to a different location, you lose that feudal call, that ability to utilize the water under a feudal call scenario. So in that situation, our highest and best use under this 4-part test was limited, given the physical possibility of moving that water to a different location. Number 3, financially feasible. So is there a market? Think of this, someone may think that the value of their water right is $1 million per acre foot. But if nobody is there to actually purchase, if there's no market, no demand for that water at that value, it is not financially feasible. And finally, the maximally productive test, which is basically evaluating what use produces the highest return, given, if that water were to be moved, what is the highest return on investment at that location, at the new location. Oftentimes, if I am valuing a water right, it is very common that the maximally productive use will be what a municipality would be willing to buy a water right for the purpose of purchasing an irrigation water right, changing it to municipal use or to augmentation use. So that is commonly the maximally productive use for a water, but that is not always the case. It may be that the maximally productive or the highest return on a water may be environmental benefit. It may be in-stream flow. Those are a little bit more challenging to value, but the highest return is not always what a municipality would be willing to buy, or the fair market value that a municipality has purchased water for. Okay. Are there any questions at this point before I go on? Okay. So hearing none, just gonna start with defining the process. So first off, not all valuations are the same, and there's different terminology that is used. And so oftentimes, I oftentimes will, help clients and perform valuations. And so the first question we ask is, what is it that you need? What type of valuation, and what is the use? How are you going to be using it? Because the use for evaluation is going to dictate, it's going to dictate the cost. It's going to dictate what goes into the level of detail and work that goes into the process. So now I will say that the type here is not necessarily like when I spoke previously about USPAP being the Bible of terminology. These phrases the opinion of value, valuation, and appraisal are not necessarily standard across the industry. So it's important to have a conversation with somebody. Oftentimes somebody may think of kind of flip the opinion of value and evaluation. So this is the terminology that I use and the team I work with at LRE Water use. So opinion of value, low formality. That is a valuation you might use for internal planning. Just kind of get that general sense, like what is I want to have a sense of what the value of my assets are. That would be an opinion of value. Next level, valuation, a little bit more formal. And I will say when we talk about formality, there's even a good range. I say a valuation is kind of a medium formality. Um, but depending on, let's say you were going to do a valuation for the purpose of um, uh, negotiating a deal, you may need to do a little bit more of a robust valuation process. But generally speaking, evaluation is good if you are doing asset management, if you are wanting to know kind of the feasibility of a project or the feasibility of moving forward with a purchase or a sale. I talked about negotiation, rate setting. And then the third level is an appraisal. And this typically is the large formal appraisal. An appraisal is often used in financing and tax matters, condemnation. If an individual was going to donate property or put their assets into a conservation easement, that would require an appraisal. And the complexity or the formality in part is driven by IRS requirements. The IRS has some very specific requirements if you are going to appraise water or property for the purpose of a conservation easement. So it's going to be your higher cost, more formal type of valuation. Okay, so next is the diligence process. So this is even before we get to the actual valuation. The consultant is going to go through a due diligence process. And, I talked about there's kind of these three levels: opinion of value, valuation, appraisal. So the extent or degree to which a consultant may drive in and kind of focus on each of these components will increase as the complexity of your valuation increases. But for the most part, every valuation is going to require some level of these various steps. So the first is just clarifying what water has been used on that land. So that might be obtaining a list of water rights from a landowner, discussing the water use, talking to the landowner, talking to the tenant farmer, getting a lay of the land. The consultant will obtain reviewed deeds, decrees, well permits, ditch bylaws. In the clarifying of what water has been used on the land, why this step becomes extremely important is I can't tell you the number of times that I may be brought on to assist a potential buyer in purchasing a ranch, a farm, an asset. And they will bring me on and they will say, here is what the realtor has shown me in terms of this property. This property has a lake, it has a ditch, it has this irrigated field. And what I will do is I will take that document from the seller, the seller's real estate broker, and I will actually start to find, well, are there actually water rights associated with each of these assets? Does that pond have a water right, or is that just a stock pond that somebody put on the property? So what we're trying to figure out is, or maybe with respect to irrigation, while water is used for irrigation of a specific field, if that water is not decreed to be irrigated there, that's very important to know. All of that goes into the value of a water right. So clarifying what water has been used, and then on the specific land. We're also going to confirm the ownership. Again, this is one of those steps that can become very complicated, depending on the level of evaluation. So it may just be obtaining, reviewing deeds. We also may need to look at not just, oftentimes there is not a separate deed for the water or for the land. So we need to look at any deeds. It might be combined, it might be separate. We need to obtain, review stock certificates. At this level, confirming that ownership, we may even need to establish that chain of title and go back and make sure, is there a clean chain of title associated with the water right that we are valuing? Okay, the next element is determining the validity of the water right. So this kind of is tied back to what I was mentioning in step one, but let's actually do a little bit deeper dive into the validity of those water rights. So we're going to be looking at diversion records, well permit files. We're going to look at the abandonment list, make sure that none of the water rights were actually on the abandonment list. Comparing actual location, actual type of use, amount of use against those legal uses. Where was the water decreed or permitted to be used? We're going to confirm and document that assessments have been paid. So if the asset that is being valued is shares in a mutual ditch company, has the owner of that share actually paid all of their assessments, and are they up to date? And then another aspect that we might look at here is easements and right-of-ways. So maybe the land where the water is used is 2 mile, 1 mile, 2 mile, 5 miles away from the source of water. So at this point, we're going to consider those easements and right-of-ways that are needed or utilized in the conveyance and the use of that water. And then the final step when we are going through a diligence process is to quantify the historical beneficial use of the water. So I intentionally have left this one short because the quantifying of historical consumptive use can be an entire 45-minute, 1-hour presentation. And so in the interest of moving forward with the rest of the valuation process. But really what we're trying to get down to here is, what was the acre foot consumptive use, or the quantification of the beneficial use. Now, I said acre foot consumptive use. Not all water has an acre foot consumptive use. We have valued in-stream flow rates, power generation, water rights for environmental purpose. So we may actually have a different measure for beneficial use given the type of water right that is being valued. But what we are doing here, and we're going to talk about this in the kind of the approaches to assessing value, is we need to get down to a common unit so that we can compare one water right to another water right. Okay, are there any questions about the due diligence process? Okay, here I hear none, but I will. I know leading up to this presentation, Paul had asked a question about the valuation process and the water court process, and are there aspects of the valuation process that also show up in the water court process? The quantification of the historical beneficial use. This is a place, and truthfully, this whole due diligence process. A lot of these steps and the outcome from this due diligence process is similar to what you would see, what an engineer would do, like myself, for an entity in a water court change case. A lot of the same steps, having to validate, verify, quantify the asset. So this diligence process, you are going to see the similarities in the water court. And so the approach in this diligence will look very similar to maybe engineering report for a change of use of a water right.
Hey, Mary, I have a question for you if you don't mind. Um,
Please.
Thank you for all this. It's been really good. But dealing with some of the other work we deal with realtors and kind of what they do, you mentioned that they kind of take that first stab at what is the value of this. How have you seen over the years their competitive market analysis change, or has it changed to
Mm.
where their valuation is more accurate going into it initially? Or is it really realtors are just taking a stab at something and then you're having to come back and fix everything on the back end? How can we help that process initially before you get all the way down this road?
That is a really good question. And I will say, in my experience, I haven't necessarily seen one specific trend. It's really broad. And different realtors have a different level of understanding of a water right. So, I guess the first thing that I would recommend is if you are dealing with a realtor and in that space and somebody says, okay, the value of a water right, okay, so an individual may say, well, I've got a 3 CFS water right that I use for irrigation. So the value of a 3 CFS water right is X. And so what I would do is coming in that conversation is, okay, well, that's great that the water rate is 3 CFS, but how much land are you irrigating? How much, what are the crops that you are irrigating? Just because you've got 3 CFS at your river head gate does not mean that your consumptive use, is you're not looking at a 3 CFS, convert it directly to acre foot consumptive use, right? You need to make sure that you're working in the same unit. So if somebody says, well, 3 CFS water rate, this 3 CFS water rate over here, it's sold for, let's say, $20,000, and say, okay, well, the common unit is not the CFS river headgate diversion. The common unit is the acre foot consumptive use. What was the beneficial use of that water on the land where it was legally, physically, and legally able to be used? So making sure that you're talking the same units is hugely important. Um, so I'd say that's the place I think where we can help um, in terms of kind of facilitating that conversation with realtors.
Thank you for that. I do have one
Yeah.
quick follow-up question. Hopefully, it doesn't derail you too much.
No.
Um, I see a lot of times where people are trying to buy a property with a well on it with no understanding versus maybe a farm. Um, how much does this play into maybe those alluvial wells that are using water rights within their wells and the way that they're being operated for a home purchase versus a land purchase? You're talking like a 1,000 acre farm. Does that play into it at all, or do you see that um, the way it's played out?
Yeah. So like maybe just make sure I understand the question. Is there a difference when valuing a well that is a home for the purpose of a home purchase versus a well versus an irrigation water right? Is that?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess the well would be maybe a hobby farm, a small hobby
Mhm,
farm versus a productive ag place. I'm talking
mhm.
like a 5 acre hobby farm, not a anything larger than that.
Yeah. I mean, even for like a hobby farm, so a hobby farm is not necessarily going to be a household, a non-exempt well or exempt well, right? It is going to most likely, if you've got a hobby farm, presumably you are irrigating 5, 10 acres. So you're still going, I would still be going through this due diligence process to say, okay, well, let's look at the permit associated with that well. Is that well permitted? Has that well been operating in priority? Or, you know, is it possible that that well has been operating out of priority and it needs an augmentation plan, given the fact that it irrigates more than the allowable acreage that the well was permitted to be utilized on. So it's still very important to make sure that the usage of the water, whether it be the irrigation water right, a well, um, uh, recreation water rights is still consistent with those permits and those and excuse me, with the permits and the water court decrees. Oftentimes too, if we're going to like say value a uh, a lot of times what we are doing is like valuing a Denver Basin well. And so, the valuation of a Denver Basin well, I mean, that, you have is going to be limited by the land ownership. So it's not just the well, but it's the land ownership. So playing into that valuation is going to be like, okay, well, what is the land associated? So for Denver Basin wells, you have to do a Senate Bill 5 analysis and quantify the legally permissible water underneath a set piece of land. So if that land ownership changes, that will could impact the amount of water available per that well, those well permits and well decrees. So really it's all about coming back to what is allowed, given the permits, given the decrees, and do the current uses and future uses align?
Thank you. That was very, very detailed compared to just the simple question I tried to ask. So thank you.
I like getting into details. Okay. Um, so with valuation, I'm going to talk about the approaches that an appraiser or an individual consultant will take when actually assessing the value of an asset. So there are three approaches that are utilized, and each of these can be used to value water rights. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how they're used. So the three approaches are going to be your sales comparison approach, your cost approach, and then capitalization of income approach. So the sales approach, this is the most common of the approaches that is used when valuing a water right. In a sales comparison approach, what you are doing is you've looked at one asset and then you are going to compare that asset to similar assets that have recently sold. Now, with this approach, there are some challenges because uh, no two water rights are the same. Even two shares in a mutual ditch company used on different pieces of land can look very different. So you need to oftentimes make adjustments to reflect the differences between the comparables. So what are some of those challenges? And so these are those adjustments and factors that are taken into consideration when doing a sales comparison approach. Well, so one of the challenges, a big one, is that county records don't require water sales to be recorded. So finding comparables can be a little challenging. It takes a little bit of work because even if a sale is recorded, oftentimes the value of the land and the water are going to be aggregated into one. So the consultant, the individual that you are, have asked to do a valuation, they may have a number of comparables that are land and water. So they need to, even with those comparables, break out the land and water component to just understand what's the value of the water piece. Not all markets are the same. So in some markets, the Middle South Platte River, a very active market, a lot of water moving, a lot of water being purchased, being sold, being purchased. Other markets, I've done some work out in Division 7, not a very active market. So not a lot of comparables. So that the number of comparable sales is going to be really driven by that, how active the market is. Also, talked about this a little bit before, but all comparables need to be expressed in terms of a common unit. I think most people know here that, two different ditch systems, a share in the Fort Lyon Canal is very different than one share in, let's say, the Pleasant Valley Ditch or the Catlin Canal, pick any other ditch. Very different. So all comparables, you need to get down to a common, kind of that common unit. So that dollars per acre foot consumptive use, that's our traditionally the common unit that is used for valuing irrigation water rights. Not always the unit we're going to use because we're not always valuing irrigation water rights, right? We talked about wells, we talked about power generation, but that's the most common. And then the other, I talked about those adjustments that need to be made. So just some of the adjustments that may be made. You need to adjust for the priority of a water right. The value of a senior water right is going to look different than the value of a junior water right. The location of the water right in relationship to where the demand is located. The storage availability. Does the water right, let's see, does, Cache la Poudre, the, water rights on the Cache la Poudre that have storage that assist for regulating demands is going to look very different than a system that does not have storage within that system that helps to regulate the demand of the users. We also need to look at yield in a dry year. Sometimes this is called firm yield. Not as common, but I have seen some situations where water quality is taken into consideration for adjustments. Prior transfer, not only prior transfer of the asset that you are valuing, but maybe prior transfers in the same ditch system. The potential for dry up, sub irrigation. Has there been was there significant sub irrigation that needs to be taken into account? And then the market competition. So even, we talked about fair market value a little bit, and willing buyer, willing seller. Well, market competition, is going to drive those costs, has the potential to drive water very high. If there are a lot of people wanting CBT water, that CBT, the cost of CBT, we have seen that skyrocket over the last couple of years. Now, granted, it has come down a little bit, but that is a perfect situation where the competition for that asset is going to drive the value up. Any questions with respect to the sales approach? Okay. The next is the replacement cost approach. So this is also called the cost approach or replacement costs. So in this scenario, what an appraiser is going to do is they're going to basically look at what is the cost to create a water supply similar in legal and physical availability on the subject property. So with respect to this is not just the cost to buy a water somewhere else, but it should include the cost to purchase water somewhere else and that actually convey that water of similar quality to the place that is needed. This is often used to verify the reasonableness of other valuation methods, or it may be used if there are no comparables. This is an approach that may be used by an appraiser. The third approach is the capitalization of income approach. So with the capitalization of income approach, what an appraiser is going to do is they're going to analyze the capitalization of the net income generated over time as a result of the beneficial use of that water. So think about the value being the net income divided by the capitalization rate. This one is a little challenging. In that it's going to be largely dependent upon the capitalization rate that the appraiser is utilizing. So if that capitalization rate is low, there's low risk, stable market, that's going to drive the value of your valuation up. But maybe there's high perceived risk or a low expected rate of return. So you're going to have a high capitalization rate. It's going to drive the value down. So again, I said that the comparable sales is the most common. This capitalization of income approach, I haven't seen it in too many valuations for water rights. But if it's a challenging water right, there's not a lot of reliable comps, or there's something about the asset that is just kind of not your normal well or irrigation water right. This is an approach that could be used. Again, similar to the cost approach, it might also just be used as a way to kind of verify what we're seeing from the comparable sales. Not all of these are used in every scenario. But going back to the table that I showed you at the beginning, as you get more complex, you may see all three of these in a formal appraisal, but you likely are not going to see these in just kind of an opinion of value. Okay, so those are the three approaches. A couple, we're about 45 minutes in, so let me just hit on a couple best practices and notable notes. So any valuation, if you receive a valuation, there's a couple elements that kind of best practice that valuation should always include. It should always specify an effective date of the value, because as we all know, as you have all seen, value can change rapidly over time. So timestamp. When is it, a value as of October 22nd, 2025? Evaluation should specify the intended use and the intended users. This is as much for, put in there for, the consultant puts that in, but also it's important, I think, as the individual that is asking for evaluation that is in there, just to clarify what is the, intended use. And then the third thing is to identify what the water right interests are that are being valued and what's not being valued. So being very clear that the valuation is just the water right, doesn't include the land, doesn't include the infrastructure. This is important for a variety of reasons. One reason is oftentimes an individual maybe that is selling a farm, selling a ranch, they may have a land appraiser come in to look at the land, look at the infrastructure, a water rights appraiser to come in, value the water. Together, those two pieces define the total value of an asset. I spoke about this a little bit before, but there is the Uniform Standards for Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP. So one thing that is important to note and talk about this a little bit is there is no, let me go flip to the next slide here. There is no formal registration, licensure, or certification that is specific to the valuation or the appraisal of water rights. So there are some individuals that do get the certification through the USPAP and they follow that process. But that is a global process. that is not a specific water rights certification. Now, generally, the qualifications for a certified appraiser or a licensed registered appraiser are going to be pretty similar, um, you know, to somebody that you may hire to do a water rights appraisal. So, general qualifications that you should look for. Does the individual regularly perform appraisals? Are they qualified to perform an appraisal of the subject type of property? So, do they have water rights experience? Do they understand what goes into a consumptive use analysis and the key components of it? It is important that they are not a donor or a relative of the donor, that the individual that is performing the appraisal understands that he or she may be liable for an intentionally false valuation. This particularly comes into play if you're doing those appraisals for things like the conservation easements, items that are going to be subject to requirements under the IRS for things like land donation. And then ensuring that the individual doing the valuation or the appraisal has no personal financial interest. Finally, just a couple notes about conservation easements, because those ones are kind of a unique, I think of these as appraisal plus, because there are a couple important aspects. So if when valuing water rights for the purpose of a conservation easement, you have to do a before the conservation easement and after the conservation easement. And then the fair market value is defined as the difference between those two values. When valuing a conservation easement, water rights cannot be subject to a conservation easement unless they are expressly included in the deed. So it might be that if an individual is interested in, pursuing a conservation easement, first thing that they need to do is look at the deeds. Are the water rights expressly included in those deeds? If not, first line of, first order of business will be to work on the deeds. And then also the water must be essential to the maintenance and protection of the conservation purposes. So that, it just can't be, I want a conservation easement because the water looks pretty running through it. The water needs to be tied to that conservation purpose. Okay, that was a lot of information, and we are at time. I want to make sure that, if there are additional questions, but here's my contact information, and happy to take questions now, or if individuals want to follow up with me, please do so. Any questions?
We've got a quiet group today.
We do.
That was well done, Mary.
Ooh, from one consultant to another. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Mary. I appreciate your time. We will post this to the website and we'll have you at our conference too. So I'm sure you'll get some questions there as well. But thank you all for joining. I appreciate it. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to continuing the conversation further.